How old would you be if you didn't know how old you were? Think about that. How old would you be if you didn't know how old you were?
I have found.
This question from the lips of Satchel Paige shoots to the very heart of the process we call aging. He was also known for another line: age is a case of mind over matter. If you don't mind, it don't matter. I think there's some real wisdom there. Because aging is largely a matter of the mind, not just a matter of the body. A lot of it's your attitude, not your age. One is only as old as his mental posture. It's more about attitudes than arteries. Attitude is the steering wheel of life, and just a slight turn leads to a radically different destination. Aging has a lot to do with our point of view, our attitudes toward it. On the subject of aging, years ago I heard Chuck Swindoll give this list. Cracked me up then, and still does. You know you're getting older when most of your dreams are reruns. The airline attendant offers you coffee, tea, or milk of magnesia. You sit down in a rocking chair and you can't get it started. Your mind makes commitments your body can't keep. That's not only a sign of aging, by the way, but yeah. The little gray-haired lady you help across the street is your wife. Everything hurts, and what doesn't hurt doesn't work. You sink your teeth into a juicy steak, and they stay there. And this is my all-time favorite. You see a pretty girl walk down the street, your pacemaker opens the garage door. I will admit, now that I am approaching that stage of life, some of those statements aren't as funny as they used to be, because they're rather painfully true. But it does lead to an interesting question. What is old age? What is that time of life we consider to be old? I mean, when I was a teenager, I thought 30 was old. Now I'm in my 50s, and 60 seems kind of young. Again, it's all about our mindset. For many years, it's been argued that old age begins maybe 60, 65. 65 was set as a retirement age. That's actually not an American invention. It was first done in Germany when life expectancy was 55. See what they were doing there? But people age at different rates, physiologically and psychologically. You can take a group of people that are the same chronological age, and they're very different. Some are very active, some are not, some are very sharp, some have lost some of their mental abilities, some are still pushing on, others are holding back. And you might guess that there's a wide diversity of age, even though each of their birth dates would tell you they were born in the same year. Now, I'm not suggesting that aging doesn't have challenges. It most certainly does. It's not always pain-free. It can be the source of all kinds of new problems and challenges. So this morning, as we wrap up our series on coping with change, we've been looking at this over the last few weeks. I want to consider a question many of us ask ourselves as we get older. What is happening with my condition? What is happening with my body, with my mind, as I get older? We're going to consider what the world has to say, what the Word has to say, and what we can do about it. Now, in one sense, you could argue that people begin aging as soon as they're born, right? But usually when we use that term aging, we're referring to the process of deterioration and movement toward death, rather than just growing older chronologically. The first half of life is usually marked by growing, by increased strength, whereas the second half of life, physically anyway, and sometimes mentally, is marked by decline and increasing weakness. During the middle years, this decline is usually gradual, and it's often made up for by experience and knowledge. I remembered a little bit. I had to have Rich remind me of the exact quote today, but back when I was playing church softball, back in my 30s, which seems like a long time ago, and when we were in our 30s, we were old compared to a lot of the teams we were playing. There was a saying that went around our team a lot, and it said, "Old age and treachery always beats youth and skill." And we like to think that anyway. But as a person moves into those mature years, and especially the senior years, that rate of decline increases. Even experience and knowledge can't always make up for diminished capacities. You and I live in an aging society. And I realize that, you could say that about any time and any place, but our culture is getting older because people are living longer. The lifespan is longer now than it was a generation or two ago. So we have more people living longer than at any time in our history. And so we see this challenge growing. People who belong to that huge segment of society born between the end of World War II and the mid-60s are finding their hair turning gray. One author put it this way: the Pepsi generation is becoming the Geritol gang. Now, the fact that some of you don't know what that means just shows how true that statement is. And many of us, for the first time, are coping with chronic illness, relentless pain, daily medication, and the exhausting and sometimes demoralizing battle against the time limits of our human frame. Now, for many, the temptation is to fall into a rut of inactivity. I'm sure you've all heard of the people who worked in the factory for 30, 35, 40 years. They retire and they just sit in a recliner all the time. One old guy put it this way: I wake up each morning, dust off my wits, pick up the paper and read the obits. If my name isn't there, I know I'm not dead, so I have a good breakfast and go back to bed. I believe there's more to growing older than just that. Ted Engstrom writes, "To know how to grow old is a masterwork of wisdom and one of the most difficult chapters in the great art of living." See, aging doesn't have to be a reason for despair. It can be a basis for hope. Not a slow decaying, but a gradual maturing. Not a fate to be undergone, but an opportunity to be embraced. It's all about our attitude. It's all about our approach. How do we view getting older? And that's going to make a big difference in what happens in our lives. So, the first step in coping with the change in our condition is to reject the propaganda of the world. And I use that word very intentionally, because there is a narrative that is out there in our culture, and it's being force-fed to us in a variety of means. And it needs to be rejected. This last week, several of us had the opportunity to attend a banquet that was given for the New Life Pregnancy Center in Decatur. And I'll tell you, it was worth the time and the cost and the effort just to listen to the man who spoke. One of the best speakers I have ever heard. And his story is heart-wrenching. When he was 10 days old, he began having physical conditions that forever altered his health. And he was in and out of the hospital in the early years of his life. At one point, when he was in a doctor's office or hospital, a woman came to his parents and said, "Did you know ahead of time that he was going to suffer like this?" And they said, "No, we had no idea." And the woman said, "That's too bad. If you had known in advance, you could have aborted it." That's how our society views people. And he made a statement. I had to write it down, and it has just stuck in my head ever since. He said, "Don't judge one's value or worth by their health." But you know, we do that all the time, don't we? How many of us, if we haven't said it ourselves, have heard an expecting parent in a conversation and someone says, "Oh, do you want a boy or a girl?" And they say, "It really doesn't matter as long as it's healthy." What does that say to the child who's not? And I know he was talking in regard to early stages of life. Children should be considered worthy and valuable, even if they have physical and psychological challenges, even from birth. They are still worthwhile. Amen to that. It also applies to the other end of the spectrum. Because once again, our culture says, unless you are productive, unless you are contributing to society, you're not worth anything. And more, the elderly are seen as a nuisance, a bother, a liability. They have to be cared for. They take up time. They take up energy. And what are they giving back? Our culture is very utilitarian in that way. One's value is measured by how much you produce. You know, if you can be a contributing member of society, that's great. But if you have little or nothing to offer tangibly, you're more of a liability than you are an asset. Now, I understand. Growing old is going to bring about a decline in our physical abilities. Now, I don't consider myself old, but I certainly can't do what I did 10 years ago and 20 years ago and 30 years ago. But does that mean that I am less valuable as a person because of that? The stereotype that our society pushes is that all old people are set in their ways, out of date, socially isolated, negative, with poor memories and physically decrepit bodies. Do you know what that's called? Ageism. And it is every bit as much a discrimination as sexism or racism. Because it's not always true. That's a myth. But it's part of the propaganda that our world is forcing down our throats. Because the time will come, mark my words, where the elderly who need care are not going to get it because society deems them not worthy. That's where we're headed. That's the attitude of our culture. The sad thing is, many elderly people who find themselves in that situation have adopted that attitude as well. And now they feel useless. They feel worthless. They feel like they're just in the way. And maybe you'd all be better off without me. Do you know that the fastest rising age group for suicide is senior citizens? Taking their own lives. Now, I realize some of it might be because they're in such horrible pain they just can't stand it anymore. But my guess is there's a whole lot of them that are taking their lives because they've been convinced that they're not worth anything. And that people would be better off without them. That is a lie, and you know where it comes from. And we need to reject it. So I suggest that we reject several myths that have arisen. These are oft-repeated beliefs that have no factual basis, but are generally accepted as true. First, the closing years of life will inevitably be less enjoyable and stimulating than the earlier years. That is a myth. That is not an absolute fact. Second, old age is a disease, synonymous with disability and ill health. Really? You're going to tell me that's true for every single senior adult? It's not. Third, the ability to change and absorb new ideas and learn new skills necessarily diminishes with age. We've got an old cliche for that. You can't teach an old dog what? New tricks. We all know it, right? But it's not true. People in their older years have abilities to learn new things and adapt things. My dad was one of them. And if you knew him, he was like the least likely to ever change in anything. And in his older years, I remember the first time we got him a computer. And I know the stereotype of old people with computers. You know, call your 5-year-old grandson to tell you how to work it, right? My dad figured that thing out, and he far surpassed my brothers and I, who had been around him for years. He learned that stuff. He learned how to write programs. He was doing all these things in his senior years and battling a lot of physical limitations. He could still do it. Fourth, that new relationships are difficult or even impossible to form and maintain in old age. Doesn't have to be that way. And it's not a scientific fact. And fifth, if you live long enough, you'll be senile. Not necessarily true. These are myths, and they need to be exposed as myths. False ideas, fake news, if you will. It is possible to grow older and never get old. Doesn't mean that enjoying a fruitful old age is automatic, but I do believe that we can. Yes, old age brings suffering of various kinds, but if we emphasize the sufferings of aging too much, we're going to start thinking of growing old as becoming a problem. That aging is a sad human fate that nobody can escape, should be avoided at all costs. That growing towards the end of life is a morbid reality that should only be acknowledged when the signs can no longer be denied. In other words, we should accept the propaganda of the world about growing old. And again, many seniors buy into it. And they feel useless. They feel shame. They feel guilt. They feel self-pity. They feel fear. But I want to tell you something right now. Those feelings do not come from God. They come from within us. And Satan loves to manipulate our emotions to go contrary to the truth. Tragically, even churches have bought into these myths as well. I mean, there was a time when young people and children, should be seen and not heard, right? Okay? And we kind of put up with kids in church. Now we have flipped the script and we're putting up with the old folks. Because we all know that church growth is all about young families. We got to get young families in here. We got to get children in here because the church is only one generation away from extinction. And if we don't get young people in here, we're not going to survive. Now there's an element of truth to that. But that does not mean that we stick the elderly folks of the congregation in the back pews and say, sit here and be quiet and just accept whatever we're doing because we're trying to get young people in here. I reject that. If it weren't for the seniors of most churches, the doors wouldn't stay open. And yet they're the ones whose opinions are ignored, whose tastes are irrelevant, because we need to be up to date. We need to be relevant. That's a myth. And it comes from the world. It doesn't come from the Word. The Bible talks about the older men teaching the younger men and the older women teaching the younger women. This idea of marketing to a certain age group is not biblical. It's the ways of the world. It's not the ways of the Word. We need to reject the propaganda of the world. It's no surprise. Many elderly people can say with Psalm 31:12, "Those who see me in the street hurry past me. I am forgotten. As good as dead in their hearts, something discarded." I want you to read that. I hope you don't feel that way, but my guess is some of you do. And if we contribute to some people feeling that way, shame on us. So how do we respond to that? It's not just about rejecting the propaganda of the world. We need to remember the promises of the Word. That's where the truth lies. Now, there are some very broad promises, like Joshua 1:5, "I will never leave you nor forsake you." That's true no matter how old you are. But there are some that are very specific. Isaiah 46:4, "Even to your old age, I shall be the same. Even to your graying years, I shall bear you. I have done it, and I shall carry you. I shall bear you. I shall deliver you." Even to your old age. God values people at every stage of life. And then the passage that I read earlier, Psalm 71. Howard Hendricks calls this a song for old age. And I can see the point. Psalm 71, beginning in verse 9. "Do not cast me away when I am old. Do not forsake me when my strength is gone." Now, I know the psalmist is praying this to God. And we know God's response. "I will not forsake you. I will not leave you when your hair turns gray and you get old." But what if this isn't a cry to the church? What if this isn't a cry to us? Our parents, our grandparents, our elderly neighbors. "Do not cast me away when I am old. Do not forsake me when my strength is gone." That hits home. "For my enemies speak against me. Those who wait to kill me conspire together." Like I said earlier, the time is coming when that's going to be the fate of older folks. They're going to be considered of no value, and they're going to be gone. They say, "God has forsaken him. Pursue him and seize him, for no one can rescue him." How many scams today are directed and targeted at seniors? Why? Because, they're vulnerable. Let's take advantage of them. "Be not far from me, O God. Come quickly, O my God, to help me. May my accusers perish in shame. May those who want to harm me be covered with scorn and disgrace. But as for me, I will always have hope. I will praise you more and more." Here's how you defeat that skepticism and that sourness that often accompanies age. We don't have to become bitter. I will always have hope. Why? Because I will praise you, God, more and more. "My mouth will tell of your righteousness, of your salvation all day long, though I know not its measure." Now, I do know some folks, older folks, that when you go to them and you strike up a conversation and you ask, "How are you doing?" you're going to get an organ recital, right? "Oh, my liver's not acting up, this, that." They give you a whole list. But every now and then you'll run across one that says, "Thank God, I'm still here and He's still with me." think you're going to bless by spending time with them and you walk away more blessed than you could ever imagine? That's a choice. It's a choice of what we focus our attention on. I will come and proclaim your mighty acts, O sovereign Lord. I will proclaim your righteousness, yours alone. Since my youth, O God, you have taught me. To this day I declare your marvelous deeds. Even when I am old and gray, do not forsake me, O God, till I declare your power to the next generation, your might to all who are to come. Are we talking about God and how great he is, or ourselves and how old and feeble we're becoming? Choice is ours. Your righteousness reaches to the skies, O God, you who have done great things. Who, O God, is like you? Though you have made me see troubles many and bitter, you will restore my life again. From the depths of the earth, you will again bring me up. Yeah, aging stinks, for lack of a more appropriate word. Aging is tough. But God will restore our lives again. Even if it's after death, calling us up from the dust, he will restore our lives again. You will increase my honor and comfort me once again. It's all about attitude, much more than about age. We need to adopt that kind of an attitude. We need to remember the promises of his word. In the New Testament, Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 4, beginning in verse 16, "Therefore we do not lose heart. But though our outward man is decaying, yet our inward man is being renewed day by day." You may feel like your outward body is falling apart, but your inward person can be renewed day by day. For our light, momentary affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond comparison. While we look at not at the things which are seen, but the things which are not seen. The things that are seen are temporal. The things that are not seen are eternal. Sure, if you focus on your declining health and your declining abilities, yeah, that's going to be depressing. But if you focus on what's to come, you focus on the promises of God, that's going to keep your spirits up. It doesn't prevent all of the ailments associated with aging, but it gives us hope beyond the hurt. And it can keep us from becoming bitter and sour old people. You might be old, but you don't have to look like you're pickled. Right? It's all about attitude. So I challenge you, resolve the pattern of your walk. I know that this message is focused on the issues of aging and the age. These concluding words apply to everybody. It doesn't matter how old you are. Old age should be a time of expectation, not escape. Of inward development, not just outward deterioration. A time of growing up, not just growing old. And those two are not necessarily the same. We must master the aging process and not be mastered by it. The problems of aging are real, but more than anything else, our attitudes will determine how we will deal with these problems and overcome them. Think about it. We really don't have a choice about growing old, but we do have a deciding vote on how we spend our years. And that vote is being cast now, whatever your age is. What you will be, you are now becoming. How we think, how we act, what we do now will formulate tomorrow. Someone called aging a do-it-yourself assignment, but it doesn't arrive suddenly at 65. When you sign up for Social Security, it doesn't begin the challenge of being older. We are actually setting the stage for it with everything we do now. Dr. Archibald Hart writes, "The best possible judgment for advancing age is to be well in the previous stage." If your adolescent years are well adjusted, for example, your early adult years are likely to be well adjusted. If they were not, you'll experience problems in that next stage. Each stage builds on the previous one. Now, it may seem this fact holds out little hope for the older person who's not well adjusted previously, but in reality, it is never too late to begin. Make the most of your present stage in life. That is the best way to assure you well adjust to your final stage. Begin where you are, whatever that is. One other author put it this way: in middle life, you don't want to make a junkyard out of your old age. But we can do that. One last scripture I want to mention before we close. It's found in the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Solomon has been on a journey through life trying to find meaning and purpose. And this chapter gives a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak book. Ecclesiastes 12:1. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years approach, when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. If I had time this morning, I would read down through the next several verses, where Solomon very graphically portrays what it's like to get older. Those diminishing faculties that we have. Ecclesiastes 12 has been called the clearest biblical picture of our later years. In fact, over a century ago, pioneer psychologist G. Stanley Hall called this Bible description the most pessimistic, albeit realistic, description of old age ever written. The Bible is realistic in its portrayal of old age, but it's positive in its attitudes. So before everything breaks down, Solomon says, remember your Creator while you are young. Well, what does that mean to remember? It's not just the ability to recall to mind. It's a commitment. It is to drop our pretense of self-sufficiency and commit ourselves to Him. We need to make God's viewpoint our own. You know, when we're young, we're always dying to do this and dying to do that. Before long, we're just dying. And before we get there, we need to live. We need to decide the direction of our lives. So if you're young, which in my book means if you're younger than me, start recognizing God's Word and His will for your life. Don't fall for Satan's lie that you've got plenty of time for that religious stuff. I can do it later. You don't know. We don't know how much time we have on this planet, and when that time's up, it's too late. Furthermore, you may have many years of your life yet to live, but later on, you may not care to or even have the ability to come back to God. So don't buy that lie of the devil. Start now. Start building toward your later years that can be full of life and not filled with thoughts of death. And if you're older, which would include me and those above, don't buy into our culture's myths that life is all but over, that you are useless and you are worthless, you're in the way. Old age is important. It's a meaningful part of God's life, every bit as much as our youth. He is interested in the waxing and the waning of life, the beginning and the end and everything in between. We often talk about young people having so much potential locked up within them and how often they never realize it. Do you know the same is true for older people? So much potential locked inside, never to be realized. Why? Because we buy the propaganda of the world and say there isn't anything left. We're sliding into home. Not necessarily. It doesn't have to be that way. We are all getting older. We can't change that. Because we cannot alter the inevitable, we can adjust to it. And we don't do that a year at a time. We do it a day at a time. Instead of eating our heart out because a few more aches and pains attach themselves to our bodies, we can determine to celebrate life rather than just endure it. Aging is not a choice, but our response to it is. In so many ways, we determine how we will grow old. That choice is ours.